Welcome back. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Wray from Aarhus University in Denmark. He is one of the few philosophers of science who publishes also usually in scientometrics. He's an expert of Thomas Kuhn works, but he works also on scientific collaboration, scientific specialization, and he's the editor of a journal called Meta Science, which is a very good journal that publishes reviews. Yeah, and let me say that it's really a pleasure that he is here. He organized at the beginning of May conference in Aarhus, where I was, on scientific publications, historical, philosophical, and sociological perspective. So you see that there are many philosophers of science that are trying to get in touch with you. The latest book he edited is Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions at 60, so a collection of essays on Kuhn's famous book, and I really highly recommend it. Very interesting. So, Brett, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, super. Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. What's interesting about being an invited speaker, and I mean, all of you have experienced this so far, is how we all interpret our invitation differently. So again, so this will be something that hasn't been done here yet, but I'll try and, I mean, I believe it's an interpretation of the theme. Now, first, as an aside, how many publish in philosophy of science journals? Just raise your hand. Because, okay, it has a special relevance for you. It's a sort of practical manual, but for the others, it's going to be interesting anyway, I'm hoping. You know, one of the things that motivates us is, and this has come up in many people's discussions, that the journal impact factor in humanities is not very useful, like measuring important journals or what have you, or because the differences are so small in the humanities that really, and also in the humanities, which philosophy of science is in the humanities, books play a significant role. So you know, this is just some background. Now, I'm doing a follow-up study here. So it's called an update, as you see. Oh, and it's not turning. Okay, I'm doing an update on a study I did before. So in 2010, I published a paper with the aim of determining the most important journals in philosophy of science. And I drew on three sort of companions, manuals, or what have you, in the field that were published in 96, 2000, 2008. So it's, let's say the data represents the field in 2000, just for short form. So what I propose to do is update our understanding of the key journals in philosophy of science. And the data I examine here are drawn from a single source in published in 2018. So this is like shoestring scientometrics, so it isn't a big data haul. And I've got 4 aims, and the 4 aims, taking you through them will be half the paper. And then the other half is just giving you the data. And I hope you'll find the data interesting. There'll be an exam at the end. Okay, I want to aim to determine whether the list of most influential journals has changed since my 2010 study. It was published in the Philosophy of Science journal, Erkenntnis. So fields change, but it is worth seeing if philosophy of science has changed much in 2000, especially our field. Like you can feel nothing happens in 20 years. So, and just to make it salient or interesting, the European Journal for Philosophy of Science began publication in 2011, and it's quite, in one way, it plays important functions in the field, which I'll talk about later. So it'll be interesting to see if the journal has had an impact in the field. My earlier study focused on journals exclusively, but monographs have a significant impact in philosophy of science. So I want to extend the study to include a study of monographs and book publishers. So, I mean, this is a theme that, as I mean, not numerous of you have repeated it, the importance of books in some fields. And I now have some empirical data that shows their significance and also which publishers are most significant. And then as a side issue in the original paper, the 2010 one, I asked about, I explored, is there evidence for a field, an integrated field of history and philosophy of science? Who said they worked in a history? Someone, Harry said he worked in history and philosophy of physics. Yeah. Center, yeah. And other people have worked in these such places, and I know others in the room have gone to such schools. So I want to revisit the question I examined briefly in the earlier paper. Is there evidence of an integrated field of history and philosophy of science? And we call HPS for short, and it's got other short forms, but I'll call HPS. Or do the two fields operate quite independently of each other? In the earlier study, I found no evidence of an integrated field. Okay. Finally, the fourth one, and this is where I thought, oh, I'd be speaking to more broadly to everyone, but I have very little to say on this, but I will address it. So I wanted to reflect on the methods employed in this in my earlier study. I thus aim to contribute to our understanding of the use of quantitative methods in the philosophy of science. So those are what I'm going to take you through. And again, it's very straightforward, so some of this will go rather quickly. I drew on just a single data source. So it was these 35 articles or entries in the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Scientific Realism. Scientific realism is like a core topic in philosophy of science, and it touches on philosophy of physics, explanation, and all these other key topics in philosophy of science. So it's a sort of reasonable source. There were 36 different authors because 2 were co-authored. And I'll tell you a bit about what is in there. There's a total of 1,280 citations in the volume. So that's the whole data set I'm going to be reporting on. 644 of the citations are to journal articles. So that's roughly 50%. 412 of the citations are to monographs. Monographs thus account for a third of the, roughly a third. I want to emphasize a monograph is a single author book, or it could be a 2-authored book, but what it is not is an edited volume with contributions. So there are these very important edited volumes that come out routinely, Boston Studies and Minnesota Studies in Philosophy of Science, and those do not count in monographs. So the remaining 224 citations are to a variety of sources, including edited volumes, chapters in volumes or handbooks, forthcoming articles that don't identify the journal, which is strange, online archives, and encyclopedia articles. So that's what we've got. Now, this is just a visualization, so I'll even pause and take a drink, actually. Would you mind looking at? So this is just to show, so this is the percentage of journal articles, books, and then, or monographs, and then remaining. Aren't books important? Okay, I'll talk about the key journals. So 129 different journals were cited, quite amazing, for a total of 644 citations. So, and all this type of data will be familiar to you people. On average, each journal was cited 5 times. 72% of the journals were only cited once, 23% were cited only twice, 7 journals were cited 3 times. I can move down to the last sentence. The remaining citations were to 11 most cited journals. So I'm going to concentrate on those, but we'll first, I'll go to those first, and then I'll come back to the skewed distribution. So these are the 11 most cited journals, and that gives the number of citations. So Philosophy of Science, which is the journal of the Philosophy of Science Association or Society in America, is the most cited. Then Synthes, British Journal for Philosophy of Science, Studies in History of Philosophy of Science A, Philosophical Studies, which is a general philosophy journal that publishes a lot of philosophy of science. The Journal of Philosophy, another general philosophy of science journal, or Kentness, and then Dialectic and Mind, and then Studies in History and Philosophy of Modern Physics, and Philosophical Review, which is a general philosophy journal that comes out of Cornell. The 11 journals, these 11 that you just saw, constitute 8.5% of the journals cited, but they account for 63% of the citations to journal articles in the volume. Again, you people are in scientometrics, you know that, right? Like you knew it when you came in the room. So the top 4 journals account for more than 40% of the citations to journal articles. So this is just showing that the 8.5% of the journals account for 63% of the citations. Just a nice, simple visual. Now, chart 2, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, it shows the percentage of journals, Y, cited X number of times in the data set. And so this will just be a distribution that you're very familiar with. And I'll draw your attention to it again when I'm showing the slide. 56% of the journals cited or cited only once, whereas the most highly cited journal is cited 106 times. So the distribution is similar to the results reported by DeSola Price and Little Science, Big Science, and other sources even earlier. So many journals are cited a few times, and a few journals are cited a lot. And nothing new. So here it is. Yeah, so there's the distribution. So nothing new to scientometricians, right? So just something on, this is now mostly to the philosophers, about the changes in the rankings from my earlier paper. So Philosophy of Science persists in being the most cited journal. The second place journal in the previous study, British Journal for Philosophy of Science, fell 1 place to 3rd. Syntas, which was ranked 4th, it took its place, so it's now 2nd. The Journal of Philosophy, which was ranked 3rd, moved down to 6th. Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, which was ranked 6th, is now 4th. Eric Kentis went from 5 to 7. So there's a little bit of movement. And Philosophical Studies is now ranked 5th. It was not ranked in the top 6 before. So that should be of interest to the philosophers when they're sending out their manuscripts, right? So now I've just grouped them into 6 groups, and these are where significant changes are in the ranking. So think of that as top tier, the philosophy of science, and then the groups 2 and 3 are clumped together, and then the remaining ones make the next tier. Now we'll go on to monographs. So let's examine the impact of monographs. Now, collecting this data actually turned out to be more challenging because I don't know what you people know about book publishers and what have you, but I had to make some decisions. So I treated the various publishers that have since merged. So Springer acquired Kluwer and Rydell, and then, so I just said, it's all Springer. I'll give it all to Springer. It's just a decision I made. And then similarly, people like Oxford University Press has a special imprint called Clarendon Press, and very important books in philosophy of science are published in Clarendon. But when people are citing them, they just put Oxford University Press instead of Clarendon sometimes. So I just clumped all of Oxford's families together, just so you know, some decisions were made here. So similarly, so that's just some background. I was shocked at the number of book publishers cited. I mean, I just did not fathom this to be the case. There were 62 different book publishers cited. It's just amazing. Monographs were cited 412 times of the total. On average, each publisher was cited 6.6 times, but there was a skewed distribution as well, which I'll show you that in a moment. 39 book publishers were cited only once, so that's about 63% of the book publishers. 8 book publishers were cited only twice. 2 book publishers were cited only 3 times, etc. You know, 1 book publisher was cited 4 times, and the remaining 12 account for 347 citations to monographs. So the 12 most cited publishers account for 84.2% of the total citations to monographs. Okay, here we are. Oh, so this is the distribution. Again, it's typical of what you would expect. And these are the top publishers. So Oxford leads the way. Oxford publishes many, many, many books, so it isn't surprising. And Cambridge publishes many books, but not many, many. And so it's not surprising they're at the top, and this is the number of citations. So it's Oxford, Cambridge, Routledge, University of Chicago Press, Harvard University Press, Springer, Princeton University Press, Dover, Blackwell, MIT, Open Court, Palgrave Macmillan. I think Palgrave might have been acquired now by Springer as well. So, okay, Oxford University Press is the publisher that produces most of the most influential books in philosophy of science, followed by Cambridge, and then by Routledge. So these three publishers account for 56% of the citations to monographs. The next most influential publishers are University of Chicago, Harvard University Press, and Springer. Okay, where are we here? So that's it on monographs, and now we're on to history and philosophy of science. So is there such a field? So in my earlier study, I argued that there was little evidence that there is an integrated field called history and philosophy of science. And these institutes sprung up in the 60s, partly due to some funding available from NSF, apparently, is the history that I've heard. So the principal evidence I cited was that the fact that the leading history of science journal, ESIS, was not cited at all in my earlier, like in the earlier study of all the articles. Not a single one cited ESIS, not a single one, just amazing. So I reasoned that if history and philosophy of science were integrated, then philosophers of science would be drawing on research in the leading history of science journal. So that was how I thought back then. Then there was a follow-up. Scott Weingart, you might know him, yeah, challenged my claim that there is not an integrated field of history and philosophy of science. So he presented an author bibliometric coupling network. He suggested that this figure provides evidence of an integrated field. So this is his figure 4 from his article, also published near Kentness. There's Elliot Sober, just so you've got some grounding. John Ehrman, who are philosophers, and up here are familiar names, Chapin, Starr, people who you might know of. I interpret the figure differently. Whereas Weingart sees evidence of connections, I was struck by the enormous gap between the two densely populated networks, a network of philosophers of science and a network of historians of science. So, I was just floored that he published this saying, and this is evidence. I didn't see it, but okay. And then there was another study that was published was addressing a similar issue that supported my conclusion. They found weak connections between key philosophy of science journals and history of science journals. So in contrast, about half of the history of science network consisted of strong ties. So there's strong ties there, but weak when you compare them with the philosophers. Okay, I'm on track. So there have been some developments in the philosophy of science in the last decades. I think some of these were discussed in earlier talks. Decades that may have led to greater integration of philosophy of science and history of science. So there's a society of the practice, the Society of the Philosophy of Science and Practice, and they've been hosting biennial conferences since 2007. How many have gone to an SPS conference? Anyone? Okay, just 2 of us. Okay. No, this is bad news, isn't it? Okay. And then there's also a committee for integrated HPS, and they use this symbol, the ampersand HPS, to catch your attention. And they also host conferences every 2 years since 2007, almost every 2 years because of COVID, of course, no one did. According to their mission statement, good history and philosophy of science is work that is both historical and philosophical at the same time. The founding insight of the modern discipline of HPS is that history and philosophy have a special affinity and one can effectively advance both simultaneously. So in light of these developments, we might expect traces of the history of science in articles by philosophers of science in the form of citations. Reasonable expectation. Thing. Given the data I present here, there's still little evidence that philosophers of science work in a larger field called integrated HPS or HPS. There's only one citation to the journal ESIS in the 604 citations to journal articles. Only one. That's hard to say there's an integrated field. And there are no citations to other history of science journals, such as the British Journal for History of Science. So it looks like we're still on our own here. But I want to be fair. So there are citations to 3 journals that purport to be integrated or cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary. And they include studies in history and philosophy of biological and biomedical sciences, studies in history and philosophy of modern physics, and studies in history and philosophy of science, which is sometimes called studies in history and philosophy of science A. So these 3 journals account for 0.3, 2.2, and 7.9% of the total citations to journals. So that's almost 10%. Now, caution is in order here. We can't just assume because articles are in there that they're integrated. As many of these, many articles in these journals are strictly philosophical or strictly historical rather than employing some sort of integrated approach to the study of science. So I'm inclined to think there's little evidence of an integrated field. I've published in these fields. I mean, I cite ISISO sometimes. So, I mean, I might very well contribute to there being some integration. I don't know. What I hope to do, and I didn't do it in time for this presentation, is look at the 51 papers that are cited in my source that are published in studies in history and philosophy of science and see if there's any citations to ESIS. So that's the sort of final stage in that to address that question. So there may be other ways in which scholars engage in an integrated HPS that do not leave traces in citations, but restricting ourselves to the data at hand, there's little evidence that such a field exists. Philosophers of science discuss examples from the history of science. That I recognize, I do it. But they do so in a manner that is quite different from what historians do. Now, I want to reflect on the methods. This is a very short section, so you don't have to worry. Citation studies are useful for finding some sort of objective measure of the importance of journals in a field. I think I'm confident of that. Such a study is suited to determining the role of monographs in the field and the importance of various book publishers. I was surprised to see that there were so many book publishers who publish monographs that have an impact. Such studies also shed light on whether scholars' preconceptions about their field are warranted. In this case, we see that despite what numerous philosophers claim, there is little evidence that there is a field of study called HPS. There's HS and PS. These results put a burden on those who claim to work in HPS, and some of my dear friends do, they make such a claim, to explain what they are doing that differs from either philosophy of science or history of science. Now, juxtaposing the results of this study with my previous study also provides some insight into the ways in a field like philosophy of science changes. On the one hand, the list of key journals has been quite stable, but on the other hand, there have been some noteworthy changes. Such quantitative studies seem especially suited to detecting changes in the field. And then a slide on limitations here. So the method I employed assumes citations can provide a reasonably comprehensive window into the influence of journals, books, and publishers. These are just one type of data one might look at, but I do not think that a larger data set would change the results. But that is a question that I can only answer confidently with gathering more data. Further, different sorts of data may be useful for understanding the relationship between the history of philosophy and philosophy of science. So I'm open to that. Now, we're here at the conclusion, so great timing here. So what are the key journals in the philosophy of science? It was my guiding question. Though there have been some changes, I discovered the list of key journals is quite stable. So in 15 years, not much changes. I also reported on the impact of monographs. Monographs account for 1/3 of the citations in the data. Finally, I revisited the issue of whether there is an integrated field. The evidence I suggest that there is no such field. Philosophers of science almost never cite contemporary historians. Philosophers appeal to the history of science and historical studies, but their use of the history of science is largely independent of what contemporary historians do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. I was surprised by the rank of synthesis, but
Yeah.
I published synthesis. It's good. Ian, please.
I show you something.
Oh.
No, okay, first, I think that the debate with Wingard,
Yeah.
that I think there's a simple way to cut it.
Yeah.
To make what we did, a detection community analysis.
Oh, yeah.
And what I think,
Do you want me to go back?
from what we see there, you will be probably right that here the computer system doing the detection community is a function that optimizes the internal relation
Yeah.
versus the external. So in between, you have some in between who make the
Yeah.
connection,
Yeah.
but it will, I'm quite sure it will create two communities. And here in the synthesis paper we did last year, I think,
Yeah.
here are exactly.
Oh,
the
okay.
connection, and there you have 4 communities.
Yeah.
You have
We're all science, philosophy of science. So
yes,
yeah.
but the
Yeah.
journal of medicine and philosophy don't show is a distinct community.
Yeah.
The philosophy of biology is a distinct community.
Yeah.
And the community that you have is Synthèse, Philosophy of Science, British Journal of Philosophy of Science,
Yeah.
are the center networks that
Yeah.
is quite stable. And,
Yeah.
but there are techniques of measuring the.
So that's published already.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
in Synthèse
Okay.
last year.
Okay. Yeah.
And, and for example, we have another small thing that we show, it's the flux of exchanges that who is citing the philosophy journal. Of course, the philosophy of science, essentially first,
Yeah.
it's this kind of thing here. First, you have the usual.
Oh, I did see. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that this goes in the direction you suggest.
Super. I love more evidence.
So I want to be worried about your data source,
Okay.
because philosophers of biology have never cared about realism and
Yeah.
analyticism, and that's why we're not in your data set.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to do about it. I mean, maybe you could think about redefining the target, like maybe this is an analysis of journals in general philosophy of
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that, yeah, I mean, I completely disagree that the data won't change with a different,
Yeah,
you're in
yeah.
the data set.
So you think the people working in philosophy, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, you think the people working in philosophy of biology are more inclined to work in history of biology as well?
Perhaps that,
Yeah.
I don't know about the HPS angle, that I don't want to
Yeah.
have, I don't want to say without data.
Yeah,
But I do know that you're, so at the Society for History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology, when it meets next year, I'll give you.
is that Ishtabibble?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll give you a nickel if you can find a talk about realism, anti-realism.
yeah, no, I didn't
It's
mean,
750 presentations.
yeah,
So-
I didn't mean to, yeah, I didn't mean to put too much stock in the realism thing, it's just, so we'll see,
Yeah. Do you have plans? Do you have plans to pick up other kinds of, because there's lots of these kinds of handbooks. It's a cool
Yeah.
idea for a data source. You could hoover more of them up.
Yeah, I might have to, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, good.
Thank you very much for the talk. So I had a similar remark to Charles, and then another one. My intuition was also that maybe talking about an handbook on scientific realism is also probably where you would find less connection with history of science. I don't know, I know I don't know too much about the
Yeah.
field to actually make a statement about this, but it seems that there can be, I don't know, some connection, some correlation between these two, right? So maybe people who actually look into philosophy, history of science, I don't know, like a book about pluralism would probably have way more, right? I don't know, that would be my intuition. But, and then I have another question, this one is really a question, is that if you think that there could be some merit in ranking, in ranking journals, not only for how many publication citations they got, but also for, say, some kind of density, because it seems that ranking Synthèse fourth, given that it publishes so many more papers than BJPS, is somewhat, I don't want to say of course wrong, because it
Yeah.
is what the data says, but it seems that, well, is really the journal impactful, or is just that it has so many publications that it's easy to cite it? I don't know, do you see what I'm?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, maybe you.
Yeah, no, I do see what you're saying. Now, about the realism not having much to do with history, in one sense, that isn't true, because one of the key arguments in the realism debate is this pessimistic meta-induction. So the basic idea, which is often traced back at least to Poincaré, but others, Poincaré notes that the history of science is a history of thrown out theories. So and Poincaré is cited, like these popular science lectures that have been published in a Dover book. So that's one of the reasons he gets cited over and over again in these things. But Poincaré didn't publish an Isis either. So and there is the other concern. There's many questions I could ask, like taking or factors I could take into account, like the volume produced by the journals, because Synthèse now is publishing so many issues and pages and what have you. It's crazy. But that wasn't what my objective was. But it's obviously something I might look into in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Brad, thanks a lot. Very nice paper. I was intrigued by your decision to look, so basically, it's really interesting because in the 1970s, 1976,
Yeah.
there was a lot of interest in the formation of disciplines
Yes.
from a scientometric perspective,
Yeah.
beautiful conference in Paris. And there they were using a more multidimensional approach to what a field is. And basically, if I understand it correctly, you have proven that philosophers of science in the data set don't cite historians of science. So how about the other way? Historians of science, are they in some way using and explicitly citing philosophy of science? Second question is, a discipline or a field is a complex phenomenon. Citations provide traces, one sort of traces. Conferences are other traces. The way people speak about the discipline is also a trace.
Yes.
So it might be the case that if enough philosophers of science claim that the field exists, although they don't cite accordingly, and some form, it might be a precursor indicator for something in the future, or there is something else going on. So usually funding, conferences, institutionalization are also interesting dimensions in addition to. So you're into a complex research program, not just one paper, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. So yeah, it's meant as a stimulus, of course.
Okay. Thanks so much. These are good remarks, all of them that are useful. All you have to do is now come and help me answer them. So I can't do historians cite philosophers. I read a lot of history, and they don't, from what I see. So they're just not, they're equally uninterested. So they're not citing contemporary philosophy. But I would have to really look to give a definitive answer. I do like your suggestion about, like, there's two ways of interpreting what you're saying about the studying, is there a discipline, and if they are speaking about it, at one point, does that sort of constitute a discipline? Now, one way is to say there's actually a third discipline. So there's this history of science, philosophy of science, and then this thing in the middle. And so I think the people I know who, I'm thinking of Hasek Chang, I'm thinking of Hannah Anderson, and many, many others, that they they're talking enough about it, maybe it can bring it into being, saying makes it so. But the other way you could interpret it is that there is, it might give evidence that there's some joined discipline. That I'm more skeptical about, that there's an integrated field. I think we've got people working in different areas, but there could be this third thing that has come up that philosophers don't cite as much, or historians, but they cite each other. So.
Thank you for this interesting work. So I'm looking at your network.
This is mine.
It isn't.
No, this is Weingart's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's from his paper. Yeah.
But it looks like that you say there's an enormous gap between the two.
I do. Yeah.
I think that what would be interesting is to look at the bridging authors.
He actually does, but I don't have the knowledge on my fingertips. But he actually does sort of go in, and I didn't find it. I'll give you the full reference, and you can sort of check it out. Yeah. So it's also in Erkenntnis.
So it's only a directed network, and I thought maybe more insight would come from a co-citation network to see which philosophers, which historians use the same, somehow co-citing from the two disciplines, but I don't know. Have you looked at that? No.
This is all I've done.
All right, we can talk later.
Yeah. Thanks. Good ideas.
So, is there any other question? Because I have a question of my own.
Okay.
So, that I studied acknowledgements in philosophy, as a way of tracing these informal networks of collaboration that do not appear from co-authorship, because philosophers tend not to co-author, but they use a lot of the acknowledgements. And now I'm conducting a project on the philosophy of science, so the acknowledgements in philosophy of science. Do you think that maybe historians of science could pop up in the acknowledgements? Like, not in the bibliographic references, not as the intellectual influence, but maybe as informal collaborators, as people are, I don't know, it's just
I got
your ideas about that.
I think you're on to something here, and where it's going to show up is with people who are in, like, it's going to be the early career people coming out of Pittsburgh, for example, which is an HPS program, and so they come out as a philosopher, but in the course of the program, they studied some history with one of the historians, because they're focusing on a special science, physics or chemistry or what have you. So I think you would see that. So I suspect you'll get that, and I picked Pittsburgh, it's one that comes to mind. Maybe Minnesota, people coming out of Minnesota, but the programs that really do have historians and philosophers, faculty there together. But many of these ones, these named, these programs that are called HPS, in the end, you got the historians sitting over there and the philosophers sitting over there. And my understanding is when Kuhn was at Princeton, there was a lot of that. Like, you either really were working with the historians or you're really working with the philosophers. And you, in fact, graduated from, like, it was recognized in the degree that you were a philosopher, a historian. So you had influence from both. Yeah. I think similar.
Yes.
Yeah, I have two remarks.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed something, but I hope I have not. So two things actually.
Yeah.
On one hand, the first one here to the network of philosophers. Actually, there are two probate tools in detecting, so to speak, topics and communities. Traditionally in scientometrics, one is of course for topics, you can use bibliographic coupling, for instance, which is very convenient. But for communities, it's almost forgotten. It's a method that was introduced or proposed by Katie McCain, if I remember correctly, is order full citation factoring, which is linked to persons. And I remember that Ole Persson from Sweden has produced hundreds of mappy on that. You might remember, and they are very useful for a different field, which is better to identify communities, persons active in this field, so authors and scientists, better than looking just at references which are related to topics. And then the second is I would be very careful with in using cited references in social sciences, most of the social sciences and humanities, because they have a completely different role in these domains. They are not always use of information, of research information. They might also indicate the subject that is under study. To give an example, Joseph Stalin is highly cited, not because he were an excellent scientist. In history, simply this rare and this the dictatorship is studied, and that is the reason why his work is also referred to. So in the humanities, there is a extreme example, but you find a lot of non-science sources, for instance, literature in sociology or in psychology. I mean, usual literature, for instance, I find a lot of citations to Franz Kafka or Thomas Mann, which is not scientific literature. So you have to be careful in using cited references. As to citations, it's no problem. These are simply absent because the use of information does not take place in journal literature, rather in monographs, books, in other forums. So here we have to make a distinction because most of these methods, even author co-citation clustering or bibliographic coupling, has been developed for the so-called hard sciences, for the sciences, where it works, where most of the literature cited has been published in journal literature or in periodicals or series at least. So that makes a difference, and that makes also a difference in the techniques that can be applied to the analysis of humanities and most of the social sciences. There are, of course, social sciences that are very similar to the sciences like economics or psychology, for instance, which is where the citation and the publication behavior is really very similar to those in the sciences. But in some fields, like in history, for instance, or in some fields I mentioned, it's quite different. So, sorry, but maybe if you go for a study of communities in terms of scientists, maybe you should prefer a kind of this method proposed by Katie McCain.
Okay. So three remarks. So one, so my first question actually was about the key journals and monographs. So this taking up the history of philosophy of science issue was just a follow-up because it looked like there was something insightful to say in the first paper. So I thought I'd follow up here. So I'll just qualify that. It doesn't absolve me of all my responsibilities. So the second one is I want to emphasize I can't take either credit or blame for this diagram or this method here because it is Weingard's, and my interactions with him have always been very positive. Unfortunately, it looks like he sort of has left academia. Is that right?
He's now working at the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Oh, okay. Well, good. So then, unfortunate for academia, but then not in another way. So I can't. So this was his approach to address my concern. Now, I do recognize the concern about Stalin, and I'll tell you one comforting thing: he was never cited once. But more seriously, I did a paper with Lutz Bornman and Robin, and looking at citation peaks in philosophy of science, and one of the things we found is Einstein's responsible for one of the peaks. Einstein has not contributed much to the philosophy of science. He's an object of study, So, so it's a classic case of it's like the Stalin case. So he's an important object of study because in philosophy of physics, it's the central sort of period.
He was a scientist and an excellent one.
Yeah, yeah. But fortunately, he wasn't cited here. So. Oh, I shouldn't knock Stalin. I haven't read him. Okay, thanks so much.